So, James, the U.S. House just approved a resolution overturning the CFPB rule that would subject big tech payment apps to the same supervisory rules as bank-owned payment apps that the agency oversees.
Oh, so a good day for Venmo, Cash App, et cetera, et cetera.
Potentially X, you
X,
know?
oh, right. Yeah, those they get into payments. Okay, so basically what you're saying is these big tech companies that have payment platforms,
Right.
they just got a holiday of they're not going to be subjected to these same really stringent regulatory guidelines that like banks would be.
Well, it's more the supervisory guidelines. Okay, so there's a difference between supervisory and regulatory.
Okay,
Supervisory guidelines mean, you know, CFPB, for example, could step in if there was, you know, questionable data sharing, for example,
okay,
or they weren't abiding by some of the regulations, like Regulation Z, truth in lending, for example.
sure.
Regulatory means they could go in there and they could actually monitor the books.
Supervisory.
No, no. Regulatory means they can go in there and they can like look at the books
Okay.
and do a full regulatory examination.
And you're saying
Supervisory,
and you're saying that does still exist?
no, that was
That
never in
was
the
never
cards.
part of it. Oh, I see. So supervisory is like the first level, and then regulatory is the second level. And you're saying they were just going to start at the first level, and now they don't even have that.
They don't even have that.
Wow, really good day for Venmo and Cash App and X and
Yeah,
everything else.
yeah.
Yeah, and
So
Google and Apple and yeah.
Apple and let's see, Apple, Google, PayPal, Square.
I wonder if there was any lobbying that went on behind the scenes
Oh,
there,
there was
Patty.
a lot of lobbying.
It's
There
like,
were a couple of high tech groups that I had never heard of before,
right,
but
right.
they were lobbying really hard for it.
I bet.
And and also, one of the things you have to realize is that, that was sort of like a pet project of Chopra, who was the director of
Right,
CFPB. And
right.
of course, as soon as Trump got into office, he fired Chopra. So,
Of course.
you know,
Okay.
it stands to reason that the most controversial rules were gonna get
Of course.
86ed.
Okay, that's a good start. What's our next story?
Okay, the Department of Justice has greenlight the Cap One Discover merger.
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. Okay, I heard about this. Tell me more about this.
Yeah. So they say, the major change of attitude, obviously, is the Biden administration, because the Biden administration was putting up roadblocks. It thought that it was going to be too big of an organization.
Well, and just to back up for 1 second to make sure our audience understands. So this is Capital One wants to buy Discover or the other way around. I can't remember.
Discover, yeah. Cap One wants to buy Discover.
Okay, all right, yeah. And so that merger was, there's always these antitrust concerns, things of that
Right.
nature. They have to make sure they're not creating a monopoly
The,
or too powerful of an organization. The government has to actually approve a merger of that size and scope. And you're saying that they have now approved that merger can go forward.
Right. The way it goes is the Department of Justice takes a look at it, makes sure there's no antitrust considerations. Then they say to the OCC and the Fed, yeah, you can approve this if you want to, or you can't approve this, depending on what they find,
And
right?
so, just to clarify how big of a deal that is, I'm literally pulling out my card right now. So, right now, my Capital One card is a MasterCard.
Right.
And so, I think what we're saying here is that Capital One, over the next however long it's going to take to get out of these agreements, all the Capital One cards are going to become Discover cards.
It could be. They said Cap One said they're going to slowly
Yeah.
migrate, okay?
Yeah. But
Uh,
that's to clarify, I mean, that's a gigantic shift.
Gigantic,
Like, Capital One
gigantic
is one of the
shift.
largest card issuers in the country.
Yeah, Cap One has access to 305 million card holders.
Wow.
Okay, and Discover is something like 100 million.
Wow. So that's a huge, huge. And again, so Discover has 100 million. So Capital One's going to go from 305 to 405 because none of the Discover people are Capital One people because
Right,
Capital One is all MasterCard right now. So
right.
this is a huge. So yeah, if you're Visa and MasterCard, you're seeing this as a pretty big threat.
Pretty big threat. According to Forbes magazine, the merger would make Cap One the nation's largest credit card issuer.
Wow. That's
And
crazy.
expectations are that Discover will retain its own brand post merger. and Cap One is going to like move some of its volume to Discover, but not all at once.
Of course. Yeah, I'm sure they have contractual obligations
Of
to
course, yeah,
MasterCard.
right. But I think as you said, this deal could chip away at the dominant role of Visa and Mastercard. It could also mean that Cap One could extract better terms from Visa and Mastercard,
Right.
right? Uh, One of the things that hasn't shown up in the reporting that I think is interesting is that Discover owns Pulse, which is a an EFT network,
Right.
and that raises question in my mind about debit routing,
Mm,
especially in a post Durbin 2.0,
mm.
in the arguments over Durbin 2.0.
Right. Well, also too, isn't it like I mean, Discover has never been big on, debit cards. It's been much more Visa and
Oh yeah,
MasterCard.
they're
So
much more credit cards.
I wonder if this is also maybe a way for Capital One to get into the debit card market, maybe.
That's exactly what I'm thinking. Yeah,
Yeah. Could be
yeah,
tough because they're going to be, it definitely would be regulated because of the size of the organization. They're
definitely.
over the 10 billion cap, so that would be interesting. But
But they
okay.
have their own. But they have their own debit network.
Right, right. Okay.
Yeah,
Wow. All
yeah.
right. That's a big one. This is action packed today, Patty. What's our next story?
Okay, Stripe is seeking a special banking charter from Georgia.
Okay.
Okay, the payments processing company, what it would be is a charter known as a merchant acquirer limited purpose bank charter.
Okay.
So that's a mouthful, right?
Yeah.
But it would give Stripe direct access to the card networks. In other words, it would no longer need to partner with other banks to process transactions.
Right. They would be their own sponsor bank.
They would be their own sponsor bank.
Mm.
Now, news of this application comes on the heels of approval from Georgia's banking regulation for Fiserv to have a similar charter.
Okay.
And the only other firm that has a similar charter is authorized by Georgia is a company called Credirax, which was acquired by Shift Four.
Okay. Sure.
So you got Shift Four, you have
Fiserv
Fiserv,
and
and you
Stripe.
have Stripe.
Hmm. It's very interesting.
That's
Well, there's just so much complexity in our industry that, that doesn't surprise me because like Stripe from the beginning has kind of been like, hey, let's fix all of these frictions points in the market.
right.
And, being their own sponsor bank is kind of an obvious, next step in that evolution.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it almost kind of surprised me when I thought about it because it was like, really, they're not already their
I
own
know.
sponsor bank?
That's what I was just thinking. I'm like, is this really like their first foray into that? But apparently, and that's it. So, and I think too, it's interesting because I think early on with Stripe, they were one of the first payfacs, and so they were able to get around banking regulations and things of that nature by being a payfac as far as underwriting guidelines. But then
Right?
now things have evolved so much that being a payfac, I mean, you still have a lot of those regulations from the bank because now the bank kind of understands what you're doing.
Yeah,
So maybe this is a way for them to kind of cut that cord, but it's interesting to me too because it could also come back to bite them in some ways. Like, they do take on a lot of high risk, a lot of garbage accounts, and
yeah,
now being their own sponsor bank, it's one of those things where it's like, be careful what you wish for. Hopefully they'll, be able to manage that operation effectively. But now you're kind of taking all the handcuffs off, and so that's
yeah.
interesting. Yeah,
Presumably they'll get some people in that know what they're
know
doing
what
a
they're
little bit
doing.
better,
Hopefully, right? Hopefully, Aquahire they'll get some people in.
right?
Wow,
Yeah,
very very
exactly.
interesting. Yeah. What other stories you got for us today, Patty?
Um, well, I reported not long ago. I think we actually spoke about this last week about how President Trump had signed an executive order eliminating checks from the nation's payments infrastructure,
Yes. Yes.
right?
Right.
And I remember you and we talked about this. I pondered whether this would prompt corporations to follow suit.
Yeah.
Well, this week I have the answer, and it's a resounding no. The irony, though, is that check fraud is running rampant.
Mm, really?
Yeah, according to the Association for Financial Professionals Payments Fraud and Control Survey, 75% of companies continue to use checks for at least some payments. At the same time, a just released Federal Reserve study shows that checks are the second most frequently experienced payment method to experience fraud.
Mm,
Only debit cards chart more fraud.
wow.
So incidences of check fraud were up 10% last year, and money loss was up 5%.
Mm,
And of course, checks are more expensive to process than our electronic payments.
right.
Think cards, right? According to the 2002 AFP payments cost benchmarking survey, the median cost of issuing a check ranged between $2 and $4. The cost of receiving checks receive went between $1 and $2.
Mm,
ACH by comparison is somewhere between 25 cents and 50 cents.
right. Right. Huh.
So it's really interesting to me. I mean, we talk a lot about the B2B market,
Right.
or not
Right.
a lot, but we've been talking
Yeah,
more
for a
and
long
more about
time.
the.
Yeah.
I think that this is a really,
It's a huge opportunity for somebody to solve this. There's a very valuable, profitable problem for someone to solve. And
yes,
whenever you see that, and there are, to be fair, I mean, there are lots of companies right now working to solve it. I've worked with several. I've talked to quite a few. Even my friend Will Messina at GrailPay, at their ACH platform, and what
right,
they're trying to solve that problem. They're trying to be the infrastructure behind solving that problem, so that
right.
other people can build on top of it. And so yeah, there's a lot of people I think right now that are working on that. What was the one? There's a couple of really interesting crypto ones on the B2B side as well. I can't remember the name of the one was something sale. But anyway, but yeah, there's a lot of really interesting tech
And
around
even and
solving
even
this.
Visa, of course,
Of course, yeah.
is working on it.
Our friend
So
Roger McNamara is over there in the B2B running
right,
that, and yeah,
exactly. So that they're working on it. If Rogers over there,
absolutely,
yeah.
absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, so that's the big those are the big highlights for today in payments.
Wow, I'm just loving this, Patty. This is action packed, and I think a lot of information for people to just kind of know what's happening. And so tune in every week as Patty gives us the most up to date information of what's been happening. We always try to record these literally the day before it goes out, so that it's really up to date. And so we'll do our best to continue bringing that information to you in a timely manner, so that you know what's happening in the payments industry. So, Patty, thank you so much for all the work you do to put this together.
Hey, thank you, James.